Let's go.
Cool. Let's go.
Ruth, could you describe how the XENOS process was initiated?
Well, XENOS began, I think, more than a year ago. Akram was invited to make a piece of work in partnership with the 1418 Now Festival, which commemorates and acknowledges the experience of the First World War over a period of 4 years. And XENOS emerged out of a desire and an intention to create a piece that recognised the contribution of colonial soldiers in the First World War. This is something that is an abiding interest of Akram's, the role that those of other nations have played in nation building. It's something that he's explored in his own work, including Desh. The complexity of contemporary identities and his own split identity. So he wanted to look at the idea of strangeness, and the title of the piece is XENOS. We started to have conversations quite a while ago about this sense that we live in a time, and we have lived in these times before, but it's particularly urgent at the moment, that we are making strangers of one another, and our xenophobia, which of course was in part brought to the fore by the Brexit referendum, and has certainly been exacerbated by political events in other parts of the world. Our xenophobia is growing and hardening in response to uncertainty and fear and instability. So we wanted to explore this idea of strangeness and estrangement within the context of the First World War. And at the heart of that is, in relation to colonial soldiers, is the experience that those soldiers had fighting a war for an empire on terms that they were unfamiliar with, for outcomes that they didn't necessarily have any part in. So the strangeness of war and the strangeness of being pulled out of your own culture to fight for somebody else's, that really is the sort of the core at the heart of the whole project. So those conversations have been going on for a long time. Akram brought to them the Prometheus myth, the myth of man being created and given the gift of fire in resistance to the gods, but that gift then becomes a curse because it leads to technologies that also produced and propelled events like the First World War.
What are your sources of inspiration and how did they evolve through the process?
My sources of inspiration are probably aligned with Akram's, because we do a lot of the early research work together and in partnership with the designers on the project. So what tends to happen is that there's the concept, the core idea, in this case the experience of colonial soldiers and those who remained in essence nameless and unknown for much of 20th century history. And then we bring together, we pool resources around that concept without making any judgment of them, on them. So we looked at, I brought certainly to the table, because I've been involved in another First World War project for Sidi Labi Shakawi, and we did a lot of research then, went to the battlefields at Ypres, and we're working in Belgium specifically on that project. So I brought to Akram some of the archival research that I had begun some years ago. And then we developed it looking at the experience of colonial soldiers. So we used archival footage from the Imperial War Museum to look not just at battle scenes and the physical context of war, but also specifically to look at the experience of shell shock, for example. And what we wanted to gather was a sense of the embodied experience of being in a war, far from home, a war being fought in languages that you don't speak, and the kinds of disorientation and dislocation involved in that. So we used a lot of archival material, inevitably, but we've also used a lot of music, influential music, to try to generate a sense of the rhythmic pulses and possibilities of, and when you think about war, you think about these sort of concussive, explosive sounds, and we wanted to explore the kinds of pulse that might be experienced in the body, or at least to find a form of representation of that. So we always work with a rich array of images and sounds of movement materials and physical materials, in particular in this case ropes, which come to stand for all sorts of different symbolic, or they come to symbolize the materials of war, not just ropes which were used so much, but also cables and communications and ideas of communication and miscommunication, the ties that bind us. Everything that we've used physically in the piece has multiple meanings, and that's something that's very common in Akram's work. So resources, music, movement, all coming together.
Could you tell us the story behind XENOS?
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. You could describe it as, in essence, the Promethean story, the story of a titan who was punished by God, Zeus, for giving fire to mankind. And Prometheus' punishment was to be chained to a mountain and to have his liver torn out by an eagle every day. The Promethean myth has got absorbed into the piece, so it's not physically visible anymore, but the meaning of it is still there, because for us the experience of soldiers, particularly soldiers involved in trench warfare, was the experience of being tied down and having your liver torn out. It was being ravaged again and again and again over long periods of time. So it was easy, it felt like a natural fit to bring those two together. But we had to locate it in a specific body, one body, which in essence has to stand for the 4 million bodies of colonial soldiers in the First World War, the nameless X or unknown soldier. And so we considered that body as Akram's body, and that soldier as a former dancer, a dance master from the court of a Nawab in India at the turn of the 20th century. And that man, that individual who lives in a full and rich culture, is pulled out of that culture, literally sucked out of that culture and spat out into the trenches, we imagined, in a very abstract sense. So we wanted to look at the idea of him as a non-combatant, in the sense that he's not a rifle-bearing soldier. He's an engineer, and his role is to lay down cables, communication cables in the trenches. Very important role, incredibly dangerous role, because those men often had to go into the front lines in order to do that. So we then just explored that experience of him having this role, this capacity, but also this skill and this memory as a dancer. And it's his memory that he carries into battle with him, and that accompanies him through whatever nightmare he encounters.
How would you describe the relationship you've developed with Akram and the artistic journey you've shared together over these past years?
Oh, I love Akram. Working with him has been really just the greatest long journey of my life, actually, a sustained, evolving relationship. We've had to learn a lot about one another's languages of response and intuitions, and he is a genius, and it is a great honour to work with him, not just him, but his team, and the way that he creates and generates a sense of connection and family around each individual project. It's been an extraordinary experience to be able to move from one project to the next, and to see him mature and develop and expand as a maker and as a thinker, as he's had children and his own life story has changed, and mine's changed alongside. So this is his last full-length solo piece, and that's a really, that really moves me. To watch him dance I find incredibly moving, because he is one of the great dancers and choreographers of his generation, of our time. And so this piece has a double poignancy. It's not just an account of a kind of global grief, but there's a more local grief, or not grief, a sorrow, but also a sense of celebration in the fact that he's there and he's making this piece, and it's a hard and a beautiful piece, I will carry it with me forever.